Good afternoon. Welcome to our October 30th, 2023 Community Policing Podcast. Today I have with me the CEO of Haven, Christine Kinal. Christine has been the CEO with Haven now for how long?
A little over a year.
And kind of brings us back. I met Christine years ago when she was a Southfield police officer. I think you were in the DB, or maybe were you the court officer at one point?
Court, I worked in the sergeant. I was a sergeant in court services and then investigations lieutenant coordinator.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's kind of a unique experience for you to be now the CEO of Haven with such an extensive investigative background in the city of Southfield.
Yes,
correct?
Absolutely. I mean, having 20 years law enforcement and now being an advocacy agency gives us a lot of feedback and a lot of collaboration, which is great with law enforcement.
Yeah. Let's talk about what Haven is first. For our viewers that are out there, I think there's this general perception that there's not many resources available for victims of domestic violence, or if you have been a victim, maybe you just don't feel like there's a lot of resources out there. So let's talk a little bit about what Haven is and what resources we provide.
Sure. So Haven is a domestic violence. We have a crisis shelter, but we handle with domestic violence, but we also deal with sexual assault. So we help people of crime of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and then victims of sexual assault. And the intimate partner violence side, a lot of people think domestic violence, you get in a fight with your brother or you get in a fight with your sister or something like that. That's not what Haven does. What we specifically do is intimate partner violence. So a significant other, partner, someone that you're dating in a dating relationship and you're needing to get out, an emergency. We provide, if people want to shut their eyes at home and just think about what you have on right now, could you actually leave the house? And would you be prepared to leave somewhere for 30 days or more? And oftentimes you can't even leave for 3 hours without preparing, and things, let alone 30 days. So from the moment they walk in, we get a client. Law enforcement oftentimes is the ball that gets kicked to Haven. It's through law enforcement referral, emergency services referral, whether it be nurses, emergency departments, fire departments. They call our crisis line, and that's the first call. Once you call the crisis line, which is one of the services we provide, at that point you determine whether or not you have a need or an ability to leave. And we try to create safety planning, assess the situation and what you're going through, and assess if Haven's the right fit for you. And then from there, we do an intake. If we feel you're a good fit for a crisis shelter, emergency shelter, then we'll start doing an intake form and do an assessment, making sure it's a good fit. And then when you come into shelter, we start providing basic needs. It could be clothing, children's clothing. We register for the children for school. We collaborate with, like if you have one of your taxpayers here, your customers that you would come to Haven, we would see if Bloomfield Schools could coordinate and collaborate with transportation. We provide, outside of the basic needs, we provide food, dietary restrictions, anything and everything in shelter. We provide internet use, computers, so we can do job applications, help people look for jobs so they can become financial and self-sustainable. We connect them with a case manager for housing assistance, see if they can qualify for Section 8 housing, and if they can't, we have partnerships with our development director that allow us to waive some of those fees. So if you have to leave your home today and you don't have financial ability, but you know you're going to get that next check in 2 weeks, then we can temporarily house you and then look for that partnership with an apartment complex. We provide everything. The minute you leave shelter, we do have resource room that connects with resources throughout Oakland County is what we try to do, but also throughout the state. And we collaborate with people on a national level. So we can find, if you want to leave out of state, we're able to collaborate with other sister agencies.
And is Haven a national model? Is this a national model, or is it more Oakland County or state of Michigan based?
So yes, and it's all of it. Haven is specifically, when I say targeted, we primarily serve people of Oakland County because we're primarily funded by Oakland County donors, municipalities, and grant money, and then the state. And when I say the state, it's definitely a collaborative effort with sister agencies within the state and other counties. And we try to collaborate with resources. So I might have, like Avalon in Detroit is a sexual assault center, but they might have someone who's experienced IPV or other intimate partner violence, but need more of a crisis shelter. So we collaborate with others to make sure those dollars get spent and go a long way in servicing each other. But on a national level, it is a movement that's been on the national level since the 70s. So Haven's been around since 1975. Our doors first opened, but even prior to then, there was a movement that was occurring nationally for women's rights and advocating for yourself and understanding what happens in the home, what's acceptable, what's not. So on a national level, I would say that our philosophy, our way of trying to find root solutions, so it's a grassroots solution, is from within the home, from within the schools, is try to make awareness. So
Yeah.
that definitely is a national model.
So we kind of talked about this before we went on the show. Obviously, with your history as a law enforcement or a first responder earlier on in your career, you were responding to these runs, and we talked about the differences from today, how we respond and spend time with our victims of that domestic violence. And I think when we think victims, right to our minds, you and I both probably from day one would think female victims.
Sure.
Right? Sure. But things have changed so drastically over the years that we do run into, plenty of husbands or whatever type of significant other are also can be victims as well. So, but we talked a little bit before about just before we got to a house on a domestic, we solved the problem, we separated the parties, and we went back out, and we didn't really worry about those repeat calls and things of that nature. So, and really Haven's kind of helped build us past that. It is victim focused. Let's get people out of relationships or an environment where they're not safe.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Two things I'll mention. One, the relationship with law enforcement, and I'll tell you to push pause on that one.
Yep.
The first one, what I would say is over time with law enforcement itself, I guess we could start there. When I started the job in 1999, law enforcement we were reactive and responsive to the caller, right? So, and there still is times I'm sure you guys are still doing that, but you respond to a 911 call but you have capacity too, right? You have another call. I mean, I worked for the city of Southfield, so it was 90,000 calls for service a year, and you had 60 patrol officers answering those 90,000 calls. I would say conservatively a third, probably even more like half of those calls for service are domestic violence related, and a large amount of them are intimate partner violence related. So you go back how many times? I mean, you probably can name 20 households in your community that you guys are going back and forth and back and forth. And so
Sometimes multiple times in a day.
Multiple times in a day, yeah. because and then again, you're dealing with capacity. So the real issue is you don't have enough officers. You can't have one officer per household. That's certainly not going to happen. But what can come to a solution, or at least us driving for a solution, right, to eradicate domestic violence would be wonderful. That's our mission, yeah. Is to provide resources such as Haven in your community, and Haven's here. So what it takes is that systems change. So organizations like Haven and law enforcement is for us to collaborate and find root solutions. And one of the things we're working on, Yvette Brown, our new social action director, is tasked with is she's got a fantastic team that works within the law enforcement communities, works on crisis response teams, and our goal is to reestablish, and it's constantly reestablishing these relationships with law enforcement, the judges, and anybody else in systems, prosecutors, is to get what is the response, what is the resource available to you at Haven? Do the officers understand when they come in through your field training program? Do the residents understand coming into their emergency departments? Do those young firemen understand, and the young assistant prosecutors? And the answer oftentimes is no, because it's not established in process or policy at the organizational level, which is where we need collaboration with police chiefs, fire chiefs, the head prosecutors, Karen McDonald, any one of those. And that's where, once we get it established in policy and process that Haven, you have a sexual assault, you shall call Haven. That young officer knows in field training. You have a intimate partner violence situation, or we're out for the second time, you shall call Haven, or make a referral to Haven, or give them a citizen information sheet with Haven's number. So that's kind of what's changed over the years. Is one, the agencies like ours exist, and two, law enforcement is absolutely collaborative in this process, where maybe you and I wouldn't have seen that 25 years ago. They would have said, just leave. We were really archaic, right? Like, we were archaic in our thinking. We were just, why did they stay? I mean, they're the ones who chose to go back. But the reality is people, it's just not that easy.
It's not that easy. And let's talk a little bit about some of those, our victims that we do deal with. If we make I guess the victims aren't alone, correct? With Haven, that's part of the process. Is there's advocates that, let's just say we make any type of intimate partner violence arrest, and Haven becomes involved, or there's a prosecution portion of it, or let's just say it's an aggravated domestic or a repeat, that through the court process, Haven will, with work in the prosecutor's office, will have a victim advocate present with that victim throughout the process to kind of have that person to lean on a little bit,
Sure.
but not a little bit, a lot, really, during that process.
Sure. So they'll, so again, through that referrals and through process and policy with our collaborative partners, is they'll know that Haven exists. So we're not at every single intimate partner violence case or domestic violence case, but we try to be, or at least, we want everybody to know. I mean, the more we're there, then the more funding we can get, and the more we can make a bigger impact. Yeah. So, but it starts with the advocates being called from the crisis line. Law enforcement might make that referral. I mean, in the city of Southfield, is running the investigations. I would mandate it, knowing of the resources, but those advocates would come right on site at the time. You could have some type of crime that you're investigating, and you have a victim there. We don't. As law enforcement, you didn't have the time to really steward that victim to the needs because you were investigating, and maybe there's still a risk to the community, and you needed that person tended to. It can start there, all the way to that person makes a referral. A detective might make a referral so that advocate can come and assist, and it does assist the detectives too, because now you can run the case and help that person, but in a constructive way, so that person's not victimized over and over and over again. Because that tends to be the case, is what's next. If someone's going through a prosecution and they choose to prosecute, what ends up happening is that story has to be told over and over again. And it's more of a task for law enforcement and prosecutors, and they're not recognizing the trauma stewardship of that victim through that process. And that's where Haven comes in. We don't expect you to. I mean, that's why our resource is there. And there's often times where, prosecutors or law enforcement will say, hey, I really like this victim here, but they don't need to sit here. And then our advocate will arrange transportation. We'll, depending on the case, we might have them off site where it's safer, so they don't have to interact with that suspect's family and put them in a bad situation. Yeah. It's a little easier to navigate for law enforcement too.
That's good. So you mentioned Yvette Brown. Obviously, Yvette came from Auburn Hills Police Department, and it's interesting that two retired law enforcement, both who spent many years in the Detective Bureau advocating for domestic violence, are now kind of overseeing part of Haven. So as the executive director in Haven, having that law enforcement perspective probably brings a lot to the Haven team alone. I
think so. I think, it was a little bit of culture shift for our agency, in more as understanding there can be a lot of misnomers with law enforcement and what our response is or what we're about. And I think the language is changing, at least in our agency I can speak to, because what they're finding is that law enforcement and emergency departments were really kind of all first response advocates. But we don't when you change that language, our advocates are like, oh my gosh, you are. Like, so there's some barriers breaking down. And I find working with our staff, we have tremendously brilliant counselors and social workers on staff that are just, with the collaboration, law enforcement, it's been tremendous. And it helps us really, because law enforcement, and our staff and counselors and our social workers know social work, right? So I can't pretend to know law enforcement if I'm a social worker, and I can't pretend to know social work if I'm a law enforcement. So the collaboration really helps us see that 360 view in advocating for victims of crime.
Yeah, and on previous shows, I mentioned we have our co-responder program, and I've mentioned it many times, is that part of the problem with the street responding officer is the lack of resources or the lack of information work. We put so many hats on, right?
Sure.
They want us to be social workers and parents and counselors and teachers and everything else. At the same time, prevent crime everywhere else, right?
Sure.
So we're putting on a lot of those hats, and we've had that talk where there always seemed to be this belief that social work and police had two different agendas, and we couldn't collaborate together. But with our co-responder program, which is our social workers that respond to runs with us, we've proven that's not true. We really, truly have one common goal in mind, and that's to seek justice for our victims, and to provide the continued resources to get people help, and prolonged help, right? So we're not coming back, because, I mean, you guys see it more in the role as you are now, but I can't tell you how many times we come back to the station or sit in roll call and maybe discuss what happened the day before or day shift, and you'll be like, man, I can't believe he or she stays in that relationship, and I can't believe, I wish we could do something more for those kids.
Sure.
And so we are advocating. Sometimes we just don't. We didn't have
capacity.
It's capacity and having the resources and knowing that the street level officer has that phone call they can make to Oakland County Health Network or to Haven to provide resources for our victims. Because we talk about domestic violence and everybody goes right to the mindset that it's physical, right? There's some type of, but there's so many different, emotional can be, and mental can be just as
Well, and it can start
harming.
early. You start with, what I was going to say, you were talking about officers responding to domestic violence, is there can't be enough thanks for you and your team and all the officers out there, because there isn't a lot of trauma stewardship for officers in dealing with this. And the unfortunate thing that's not talked about is when resources aren't given or understood or passed out, then lethality increases, right? So when they get to Haven, lethality decreases. And what the wonderful thing is of coming from law enforcement perspective, where you're dealing with victims of crime and you're investigating homicides, of people who could not get out, or the resource, and it just is, like I said, it's not easy. There's many, many reasons. Is coming to Haven, you see the referrals, you see people coming in, they're alive. They have good after bad. Like, we can almost, I can't guarantee it, but coming to Haven, there is going to be brighter days. Like you are at Haven now, there will be brighter days after. So you talk about coming to Haven, the recidivism. The one thing that's really difficult is, why do they go back, and why do they stay, and all those extra questions. It's not physical. And we have a preventative education. One of our services we provide is preventative education. And in that space is we discuss with youth about advocating for yourself, or what does advocating look like? You have a son and a daughter, but you probably have a lot of different ways you try to keep your daughter safe. You can't go out past 8. So what is it right now? Daylight savings time. You probably can't go out past 6:30. Right now, without a parent or adult or your son, you're like, just put a helmet on. What are you wearing to your daughter? You're going to college. You got to have a whistle, a mace, and everything else. But we don't talk to our sons about it. So that's it, and it starts early. Like, it doesn't have to be physical. You might have, your kids are probably getting to you said they were younger, but they're getting to the part where they're starting to have little crushes. But it can start through social media and through pressure. If you don't go out with me, I'm going to post this. You don't. So really, those cues, or the people with those tendencies, start really early. So we try to get them to recognize in the middle school, high school age, so they can learn empowerment and learning how to control their space or their outcomes a little bit, or not even control, but at least guide them. So, and then you get into adult relationships that are not physical. I make the money. you don't, and I control the money. Now you have, technology's great, right? But technology is also terrible for abusers because they're able to monitor everything. You're able to see cameras, your movement. You can't even have a conversation outside of your house anymore without it being recorded and someone being able to watch it hundreds of miles away. They're on a work trip in Texas, and you're like, whew, I can breathe. And next thing you know, they're calling you.
Who's at the front door?
And they have a camera, a Google camera that can hear every single thing you say out in your street.
Yeah, which is different. Again, we talked about the differences from when we started. I started 2000, you started 99. We didn't the technology, the text messaging, the control of having those things didn't exist then.
Apple tiles. I mean, you think you're free, you remove all these surveillance methods, and you can drop an Apple tile that's about the size of a quarter underneath your seat, or put it up. I'm giving too many ideas here, but they can track you, right? And there's ways to defeat that, and our social action team is part of being able to give resources and understanding. It's the abuse can happen in many, many, many ways. They can, hey, you want to go to the police academy, or you want to join the military, or you want to go be a doctor, and no, we don't have the money for that, and they start restricting or pushing you away from friends. I don't like when you're hanging around that person. They disrespect me in front of you, and then you start real slow moving. So it's not always physical.
Right. Was there anything in the past work at Southfield or anything that, and I know Chief Barron now is a big, strong advocate against domestic violence. Obviously from the department he came from, and then coming to Southfield, and some of the things that have occurred in Southfield the last couple of years. He's been very vocal, and it's a credit to him and to Southfield PD for bringing awareness to it. Obviously, we didn't say at the beginning, but it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, the month of October. It's obviously a big enough topic, important enough topic, that there's a whole month dedicated to the awareness, which you and I talked a little bit before, but as agencies, what are we doing to bring awareness to it? And for us, it's nonstop, right? We're always doing training. We're always trying to recognize that next step or those control methods people use. When we walk into a home and we start seeing things, what are some key contributing things that we may see that shows there's some type of physical or emotional abuse? Can be on a traffic stop. If you have a significant other's in a car, one of them won't look you in the eye. When you ask, "Hey, you doing okay today?" and they turn and look another way. Those are clues that we're constantly keying on.
Sure.
Was there anything in your career that brought you to New Haven or to be a victim advocate?
Oh, all of it, I believe. I mean, my whole childhood, all the leadership roles I fell into through high school, falling into the police department at Southfield. Every step of the way brought me, I think, to Haven. I mean, it's just that one case, right? And we could have another podcast on those cases, but
right.
There's I found when I was new into law enforcement, I was in the training program. I actually got written up, and when I say written up, it wasn't in trouble, but it was definitely. We had a daily observation report.
Still have those.
Still have those, which is a fantastic training program. But and I stand by that. But one of the days they said I spent one of the officers, again, probably started in 1972, was training me in 2001, and says spent too much time with a victim. And I came from a family. I was a single mom, victim of secondary victim of not child abuse, domestic violence, watched my mom in that type of relationship. So moved out at 16. So when I have an officer telling me I'm spending too much time with someone, where if I would have had that, my mom would have had that information that I was able to now give to a victim, I would say that's probably where it all stems from. Because now, even through 20 years, I didn't care if you want to write me up for advocating for someone that is looking for a root solution, and I kind of came that beacon of light for folks, and I was always advocating for the underdogs. So to be at Haven in this role, and to have people like Yvette and our team, Jen Porter, and all our great social workers, Marcia Scott and her whole team, and everybody else in the social action, the whole team's fantastic, are people who are willing to be the loud horns in the room and say that that's not right? Yeah. But that's why they're landing in that space.
And it's important from an outsider, not being in Haven, and that to have that, to have yourself now. Law enforcement doesn't trust, just everybody out there. So to bring reliable, experienced people onto the team to bridge that gap between law enforcement and that only will increase the advocacy every officer or everybody responding to these will have for our victims.
And I think so too.
It's big.
Because there is a distrust, right? Like for law enforcement for good reason and for social work for good reason. There's an understandable, but we're really building it because in the end we all are focused on the same mission, and I think that rapport building it's like you said, it's only going to increase for Oakland County. I feel it's a privilege to be in this seat, to be in this role, to be able to do that. And if you can name one case, right? Like one case, and I tell any detective or any officer or any advocate that we have working with us is sometimes you can get burnout, and burnout's a real thing that we have to worry about for our staff because we do internalize so much and want to do good.
We live the life of our victims sometimes.
We really do, right? So, but if you can have one person that you really took that extra minute, we're not worried about getting written up, and you took that extra minute to give them root solutions and resources, and they were able to get out, I'm sure you can name 10 right now, at the time that we've been on it. Then you're doing your job, right?
Yeah, and helping people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's our job.
It seems really
but it was a time where we did not, I won't say it was just based on how the training was, and the lack of resources that we had at the time. Yeah. And I'm glad there's organizations out there now that understand the importance of partnering in multiple ways and bringing on people, again, who can bridge that gap or that relationship. I mean, just speaking from my experience, knowing Yvette, that'd be somebody I would have relied on from our own agency. Like, hey, absolutely. You have a female detective. Maybe we have two now, but we only had one at one point. Sure. If you have a female victim, she would be somebody I would have reached out to in a heartbeat to say, can you help us out? And I know for a fact that her chiefs at the time would have reciprocated that and allowed that to happen. So those are just important aspects especially as a chief, to know, that we can rely on our partners when it comes in. Again, and I go back again for our co-responders that do it. They respond to a lot of our domestic violence runs with us.
That's fantastic.
Or they follow up, because there are so many times where there is a mental health challenge or a substance abuse challenge within that relationship that is kind of that root cause of some of it. And if we can help try to either identify it or help get out of it, we've really been successful. And I tell our guys all the time, and I think our trainers, Lieutenant Pizzuti and many of the others, we always talk about when you enter someone's life on the road, in their home, we're brought into the middle of it, right? We're brought into the middle of it it could be years and years and years of something, but everybody's got a story, and we don't know what chapter we entered it in. Right,
yeah,
or what paragraph of that chapter did we go through?
Very true.
Let's talk a little bit about how common domestic violence is.
Well, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, just from my point of view. You could probably tell me the stats for your city, but you look at all the calls for service that any jurisdiction get, you could arguably say half their calls are domestic violence related, right? They're relationship related, they're son, father, parenting issues, and then of those calls, there's a larger percentage of those that are intimate partner related. So that's pretty busy when you're talking about on a national scale. Whether if you're in the UP or you're in Bloomfield or Southfield, it's going to be half of those calls. And then it's very underreported. So by the time someone calls law enforcement or calls Haven, what we have to remember is just those in the community that aren't really understanding our conversation right now, but is that it takes that person 7 to 10 times just to call. Or 7 to 10 times where it was like, God, he was really kind of rude to me in that text, or I don't really understand. Now he's telling me I can't go to college there, like I'm feeling, or I can't go after that scholarship. And it starts young, right? You're 17, you're getting looked at for colleges, and they're like, well,
the manipulation behind
they start manipulating, so by the time it could be 10 incidents later where they finally maybe make a disclosure, right? So it's unfortunately very common. As you said, it takes up a whole month for awareness, could probably take a whole year. But we try to get people's awareness, because if you talk too much, right, then they'll be tone deaf to it. So I think what's important for your listeners is that the one thing that happens that people, regardless of all the changes we've made in the last 25 years, is collaborative partners, is people make a disclosure. You might even have an officer making a disclosure to you. right? Like, hey, I'm going through some hard times, and you'll get through it, and
Pat him on the back. We got you.
Yeah, we got you, right? Or you think you have an employee that's a problem when really they have a problem. To our listeners, you have a child who, an adult child who's disclosing something to you, and you're like, just leave them. It's what they need to do is listen and then believe them. Try not to give advice that you're not sure about. If you're not sure that's what the person disclosing to you is ready for, that's where Haven comes in to play. Is we try to help them because if the person isn't empowered to make change, they're not going to make the change.
And they're not going to do it in the 15 minutes that we're at their residence.
And they're not going to do it in the 10, 15 minutes, number one. But number two, it's the empowerment. If we do want someone, again, it's the one person. We get 30,000 services we provide a year at Haven, but you might get 30 that have made it out and up and on that year, right? So, but the next year we might get 60 more, right? So we never really know what the ending outcome is, but it starts with that first disclosure is believing them and supporting them.
And through Haven, do you guys see a pattern when we talk to our victims of where that manipulation then becomes to violence? And I know, we watched the news last week where I believe it was Clinton Township had a domestic murder, we'll call it. And then it gets to that strangulation level. It gets to that where it could turn fatal. Or is there any key factors that we're missing or a victim may be missing that they need to get out? And I know it's probably different for everything. But is there anything that's a real, key contributor?
Well, there's and you can Google it, and I hate to point to Google, but it's easier. It's for people to look at is the power and control wheel, and that was researched by a lot of psychologists, and when you look at it, you start to recognize like, wait a second, this is a lot of what's going on in my life. Then you probably want to call us. As far as lethality, it's a really hard thing to assess, which Oakland County and law enforcement have been fantastic in understanding that, and with the judges, is we have the lethality assessment when you guys do go out to scenes. That's helped, but it's not something you can predict. I could tell you there's all kinds of indicators, right? There's red flags, previous weapons charges, doesn't have a job, controls, all these different measures. Has struck before, strikes the children. But we also have the same amount of homicides with people who've never committed a crime, but their spouse is leaving them and there's no way out, right? They have a misdemeanor domestic violence charge or a disorderly conduct, right? That ends up in a fatal situation. So there is really no straight answer of because it is one of the most unpredictable crimes, because you just can't know what people are thinking.
Right. What can we do as a community to make your job easier?
Oh, well, I would always put a call to action. In our call to action, it usually comes at the end. Yeah. So we'll always take a moment and say, okay, what can our community do? Well, first off, do you have disclosures from students, coworkers, family, friends, someone who's saying in a relationship and they're needing help, refer Haven, and let us help someone's safety plan and figure out what's next. But also volunteering. We're only 50 strong. So like I said, with 30,000, we average around 30,000 services that we provide per year.
Wow.
Whether it's a counseling session, or a night in shelter, or our social action advocates out in community. That's a big number. So, but there's also other things, like we have skilled volunteers that we could utilize. So if you have a skill specific that you would want to volunteer at, we would love to have you. Or just volunteering in any capacity. We have people helping clean up our yard, helping us mow, organize donations so we can, because again, any time that people give us is valued. Yeah. And then of course you can go to our website and donate. Financially, we are 100% funded through grant and donor, about 2/3 through grants through the state, which is taxpayers, and then or Victims of Crime or Act, we're funded through that, and then the rest is through donors like your viewers.
Yeah, and I would assume are there peer advocates, people who've been through domestic violence and escaped as part of your team or as part of like a peer coach or anything like that? Like I know Families Against Narcotic has those peer coaches or recovered addicts that come out and try to, help the victims out. Somebody that's been in those shoes.
Well, what we found, even though we don't really carry it, is what we found is majority of our employees have are a survivor in some capacity.
Which probably drove them to it.
Right? So yes, and then we have a survivors speakers bureau where we have survivors who are past, they've moved forward and they're in a space now where they do want to give back in like an advocacy activism way where they can improve their communities. So we have a whole, they come to events and help us kind of relay their stories and people can connect through that way. But we don't have a team per se that someone.
Yeah, but there's people in there. There's people as part of the organization that understand if I'm the victim, what I'm going through and why it's so hard for me and can walk me through those next dark. Because the first week, I'd imagine, first week is dark. The second week, it's a little lighter. And as the time goes on, things
just coming into shelter and not having anything.
Yeah.
So we've, I did mention one of our other services, counselors. So even if someone's in shelter, we do have, if we're too busy for counseling, all counseling services are free. Some people are in it 1 year, 2 year. We don't put a time limit on counseling because you might get through it in 6 months, but then you might start dating again in 2 or 3 years. And what you don't want to do is repeat, and make sure that, we have people who check in, and I don't want to fall into those same patterns with this person and make sure. But what we do offer, even if we're to capacity in counseling, is we do have group counseling. So we offer something. So even folks in shelter can come over to group counseling once a week.
Yeah, good. Mm-hmm. So if any of our listeners want to get into Haven, what's the email or what's the website address?
It's haven-oakland.org.
Okay.
O-R-G.
And is there a tip line or a phone number that they would call?
There is. I'll get it out because I get mine confused and the tip line. So it's 248-334-1274.
And that's for anybody to call in, either give a tip or if they're a victim themselves and need help.
Yeah.
And I think it's important we talked about it, again, before the show, about us becoming more partners with Haven and working with our community relations officers to push out the information. The more that's seen, the more people will get confident and feel empowered to get out of these relationships.
Well, I'll say with Southfield, we put it in our policy. So
we have a long domestic violence policy, and we have all the victim rights forms that all have those phone numbers on them. And, that's a requirement of ours to give out.
Thank you.
And I know, like I said, typically when you get into these situations, it doesn't really matter. I feel like the detectives end up, living the life of those victims sometimes, especially if it's a repeat person who they know is afraid to get out, and they're trying to encourage, and you guys develop those relationships in the detective bureaus. I always said there was times where I could tell when some of our detectives were emotionally connected to this, knowing fearing what the outcome could be if they didn't try to advocate on behalf of the victims. And I think that's, again, when we started, it's important for the listeners to know and our communities to know that we do have these behind the scenes conversations, that we have policies, and we can't always save everybody. Right? Unfortunately, personal protection orders and domestic violence conditional bond orders are on paper. We can only do so much to protect. We need the victims to be powerful and families to let us know what's going on so we can do it. So I want to thank you for coming today. It's such an important topic. Like you said, we could probably spend hours on it. I look forward to bringing Yvette on another time so we can further this conversation and about how important it is. But being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I think it's important for you to be here, and I want to thank you for your time.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having us on and putting Haven in the light.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Chief.
Yes. And we want to thank you for watching our community policing podcast today. Such an important topic for our listeners and our residents to know. And if you know of anybody that's struggling in a relationship or is involved in a domestic violence, please reach out to either our department, if it's an emergency, 911, or reach out to Haven. Thank you for watching.